In this section of the course, we're going to look at more things we can do with subs, and we're also going to introduce functions. So let's start off in this lesson by calling other subs. Now the best way to explain this is by using an example. In the code you can see on the screen here, we have 3 small subs, and each of the subs simply prints out a value from a cell. So we're using cells A1, B1 and C1. And we're just running all of these now, and you can see they just print out the contents of each cell. So far so good. So now we have a new requirement that at the end of each sub we want to print out the names of all the worksheets in the workbook. So let's just put a comment here. Now I'm just going to go ahead and add this code. So now we have the code in the sub, and this code will print out the names of each of the worksheets. So let's add it to all our subs. So now we have the code in our 3 subs. So this will print out the sheet names in each sub when we run it. So let's delete what we have in the immediate window, and then when we run we can see that it worked correctly. So we tried it in 2 and we tried it in 3, and you can see that it worked correctly. It prints out the value and then it prints out the name of the 2 worksheets. So this code is not really neat, because each time we want to print out the names of the worksheets, we're copying and pasting this code. So if we wanted to do it 10 times, we'd have 40 lines of code. So a much neater way to do this is to place this code that we're using a lot in its own sub. And then we just call the sub. And to call the sub, we simply use the name of the sub. So everywhere we have this code now, we can just replace with the name of the sub. And not only is our code much neater, it's also much clearer what our code is doing. So we can see clearly that our code is printing out a value, and then it is calling the print name sub. So we'll run this one and you'll see that it worked just as well. And again, it works just as well, except it's just that bit neater. So this is why having commonly used code in its own function is quite useful. Now we can call this as many times as we want from one sub to another. So we'll delete this data and run it again, and you can see that it ran twice. Now in the next lesson we'll see how we can pass parameters to a subroutine that we're calling. In this lesson we're going to look at passing arguments to subs. So let us first of all look at a function in Excel. Now the function we're looking at here is sum, and if we click on the function dialog, you can see here that this function takes a range as an argument. Now taking a range as an argument allows us a lot of flexibility. It means that each time we call sum, we can give it different ranges, and sum will just work on the ranges we provide. So we can do something similar in our own code. So this is the code we had the last time. Now let's close down some windows here just to make our screen a bit clearer. Now this time we're going to use the range as an argument. And passing as an argument, we declare the name we want to give it, which is our name, and we're going to call it RG, and then the type. Now you notice this is very similar to declaring a variable using dim. So once we have the argument, we can then use this argument within our sub. So what we're going to do in this case is, rather than print out the value of the range before the sub, we're going to pass the value into the sub and then let our print name sub print out the name. And so when we ran the code, you see that it printed out the value that was in the range A1. So we make this change for all our different calls. And we'll just put just a comment here just to state what we're doing. So let's just make the change for the last one. Now, a subtle difference to notice here is an argument is what you pass to the sub, and the parameter is what's declared in the sub. So this is quite a subtle difference. So now we're looking at a second example. Now in this example, what we want to do is we're going to take the first name and the second name of a person, and we're going to print it in the format similar to a bibliography. So in other words, we're going to have the surname, a comma, and the first name. So let's just do our call first. Now again, we use the name of our variable as and the type, and in this case is a string. And we separate our variables by using a comma. So again, the name as, and we're going to have a string. So now we'll set name equal to the second name, then plus comma and the space and plus the first name, and this gives us our correct format. And then we'll use debug print on this name variable. So running the code, you can see that it printed out in the correct format. So you can see by adding different names here that it will print them all out correctly. And this could be useful if we had a load of names on a worksheet where we can go through them all and print them in the correct format, and we don't need to keep rewriting the format code. So again we run, and you see that it's printed them out in the correct format. Now another advantage of having one function for doing the format or one sub for doing the format is that if we decide to change the format, we only need to make the change in one place. So say we want to replace the comma with a colon. So we can easily just replace it one time and it will work for all. So let's run it again, and you can see that it's changed for them all. So this is another useful reason. This is another reason why we use subs. So now in the next lesson, we're going to look at functions, and these are very similar to subs. So at the start of this lesson, we're going to step through code and just see how the call works. And then in the next part of the lesson, we're going to look at functions. So here we're calling the perform calc sub, and we pass it two values. So if we use our normal step into icon, we can step through the code. Now, when the code reaches a sub, it will actually step into it. So this is what step into means. So it steps inside the sub, and if it meets another sub, it will continue to step inside. Now there's a button to the right of step into, and this is called step over. So let's go to this line again. Now if we click step over here, it will skip this sub. So in other words, it will perform the code in the sub, but it won't go into the sub, and it will continue on the next line. And we've one final button, which is step out of. When we click step out of, it steps out of the whatever sub it's in and continues on in the sub that called it. So these are quite similar, different icons, but they're quite useful, and sometimes one is more useful than the other. Now what we want to do here is we want to get the value back from the perform calc sub, and we want to print it out. So how do we do this? Well, how we do it is we make it into a function, and the main difference between a function and a sub is that a function returns a value. Now we place a value after the parenthesis, as long you can see, and this tells the type of value we're returning. Now to return the value, we simply set the value to be assigned to the name of the function, and this will return it. So the next thing we need to do is get the value back from the function. And we do this again by we put the function on the right hand side of an assign, and when we do this, keep in mind that we need to use parentheses. So we'll step through this code now and you can see how it works. So let's have a look in the locals window. So we can see at the moment that result is 0. So we step down into our function, and here we have val5 and val2 is 2. So when we step over this line, you can see now that there's a variable in the locals window called performCalc, and this has the value 52. So our function now will return this 52. And now you can see res in the original sub has the value 52, and this will be the value to be printed out. And again, you can see that it printed it out. So let's step into this again. So we can see here that res equals 0. And we're going to step over it this time. And we step over, you see that res now equals 52. So it returned the value 52 and it wrote it to the immediate window. So this was our first look at functions and how they work. And in the next lesson, we'll have another look at a few examples of using a function. So the difference between subs and functions is that functions return a value and subs do not. Now there's also two other differences between subs and functions, and this is what we're going to look at in this lesson. So we have a new workbook here, and we're going to create a module, and we're going to create a new sub, and then we're going to create a new function. So let's just call our sub test sub. And so we're not going to place any code here, as we don't need it for the demonstration. Now we are going to put some code in the function, and you'll see why later in the lesson. So we're just going to multiply two values together. In other words, testFunt is going to return the argument A multiplied by the argument B. So again, we declare our variables by saying as type, so A as long, B as long. So now we have one sub here called test sub, and we have a function called testfunc. So let's go into our worksheet. Now if we bring up macros, you can see here that the only macro available is test sub. And so the only thing you can run from macros is a sub. So as I've said very early on in the course, a sub and a macro are the same thing. We cannot run a function from a button or from a macro. Now, here's a second thing to look at. If we type in TE, you can see our function appears here in the function list. So when we bring up the dialog, and it even shows the variables that we have. So we have a variable A and a variable B. So we can just use this function the same way as we use a normal Excel function. And you can even see the result of 30 is available. So we click OK and we're getting 30 in this cell. So we can even pass values from other cells. So to all intents and purposes, this is our custom function, and it's the same as any other function that Excel provides. Now the one difference between this function is that this function is only available in the current workbook. So in other words, it's only available in the workbooks where we have this function. And you can see there that we passed the two values from B3 and C3, and it multiplies them just like a normal function. So in the next lesson, we'll go ahead and look at some more function examples. There are two ways of passing arguments into subs and functions, by ref and by val. Now so far we've been using by ref, and the reason we have is because by ref is the default value. So we decide which type by putting either by ref or by val before the argument. Now let's step through this code to show you what byref means. When we pass byref into a sub or a function, we're actually passing the same variable. So in other words, if we change the variable in the function or the sub, it will be changed when we get back out of it. So here we can see that val now equals 7 because we set it to 7 in perform calc and we passed byref. Now the second way we can pass a value in is by val, and this is the one that we should use when dealing with basic variable types. Changing values through parameters is not considered good programming practice. So here we're using by val, and because we use by val, this means that we're only given the value to the sub, so the actual variable will not be changed. So when we leave the perform calc here, val returns back to the value 4. So if we're passing basic variable types, we should always pass by val. This ensures that they won't get changed by accident. VBA provides a way of having optional parameters. These are parameters that have default values. So when we call the sub or function, we don't need to supply a value. The function will use its own default. Now the easiest way to explain this, of course, is with an example. So let's run the code we have here. And the code we have here is passing 20 into the print student number sub and then printing out that value. So let's make this an optional parameter. And we do this by using the keyword optional. And we place a default value at the end. Now we don't have to place a default value, and if we don't place one, the value will be, in this case, 0. If it's a string, the default will be an empty string. But it's good practice to put in the default value. Now we ran this code and you see it printed out 20, even though we did not pass it a parameter. Now this time we're going to pass 35. So 35 was printed. So if we supply a parameter, it uses this parameter. If we don't supply one, it uses the default. Now this is used in a lot of VBA functions. The order of optional parameters must be that the normal parameters come first. So in other words, once we use an optional parameter, the only parameters after this can be optional ones. So let's just show you here. Here we're just declaring a normal parameter after the optional one, and as you see, VBA gives an error. So let's just make these both into optional parameters. And we're going to set two different values, 20 and 30. So again, we run this without parameters and it will print out the two default values. So it will just print classes on the same line as student no. So we get the two default values printed out. So imagine we just wanted to set a value to the second optional parameter only. So in other words, we want to use the default student no, but we want to set the value of classes. Well, what we can do is just put in a blank argument. In other words, we put in no argument and just put in the comma. And when we run it, we'll get 56 for the classes value and we'll get 20 for the original student no. Now while this is fine to use, there's a better way of using it, and that is by assigning the actual parameter by using colon equals. And this works exactly the same way. The difference is, however, this is much more readable and it makes it much more obvious what your code is doing. Now in this case we're setting the student no. So if you had like 7 or 8 optional parameters, using commas doesn't make it that clear what exactly you're doing. Now we've already seen a function called borders around, and borders around, you may remember, had optional parameters. Now lots of VBA functions have optional parameters, so let's just have a look at this again. So borders around simply puts borders around a range of cells. So when we hit space here, you'll see a list of all the parameters, and you can see the ones that are optional. So for example, if we want to use the color index, we can just type color index and then colon equals, and the IntelliSense will bring up the actual options. So when we hit equals, you can see we have the two options, and we'll just select X cell color index none. And so these are very commonly used in VBA, and it's very useful to use the colon equals when we're selecting these parameters.